Okay, welcome back to Law and Legal Process. I'm your professor, Shane Nelson, and today we're going to be beginning one of the more important and honestly one of the more uncomfortable conversations in law. That being, what do we owe to other people? More specifically, when does a moral obligation become a legal duty? So this question sits at the heart of today's lecture. We're going to be focusing primarily on the famous case of People v. Beardsley, which asks whether someone can be criminally liable for failing to help another person in danger. Then afterwards, we're going to compare that case to Marsalis v. LaSalle, which explores how legal duties can arise once someone voluntarily takes responsibility for helping another person. This lecture, as you're aware, is about ethics, but it's also about limits. The law does not punish every immoral act, and understanding why that is one of the more foundational ideas of our American legal system. So let's start with a simple hypothetical. Imagine you're walking past a lake and you see someone drowning. You know how to swim. You could probably save them safely, but instead you continue to walk the other way. Most people would probably say that behavior is morally wrong, but here's the real legal question. Should that be a crime? Should the government be allowed to punish someone for simply failing to help another person? And this is where ethics and the law begin to separate. Many things are immoral but perfectly legal. Many things are illegal even if some people believe they're morally justified. Law and morality sometimes overlap, but they're not identical. So, what is ethics? Well, when you look at your Schubert textbook, it defines ethics as the study of morality. Ethics asks questions like, what is the right thing to do? What obligations do we owe to others? What makes conduct morally good or morally wrong? Schubert also explains that philosophers have debated these questions for centuries. Importantly, the law does not always provide us with clear answers to these moral questions. Instead, the law tries to create rules that courts can realistically apply consistently. And this distinction becomes critically important in today's cases. Schubert discusses something called normative ethics. Normative ethics focuses on practical moral questions such as, is killing in self-defense wrong? Do we owe obligations to strangers? Should physicians assist terminally ill patients in dying? If you remember Washington v. Glucksberg, the answer to that originally was no. Do we have a duty to rescue others? Now, notice that these are not abstract philosophical questions anymore. These become real legal questions. And the courts often struggle with where morality should end and where legal liability should begin. So the next assignment you're responsible for is watching episode 1 of Death Note Rebirth. So think about the main character, Light. This guy believes that he's morally justified, and he honestly convinces himself that what he's doing is morally correct because he believes that he's creating a better world in the process. But the important part is this. Believing something is morally justified does not automatically make it lawful. The law places limits on individuals acting on personal moral beliefs. And that same tension appears in today's lecture. Can the law force people to act morally toward others? And this is where we step into our main case of People v. Beardsley. So this is one of the more famous omission liability cases in American criminal law. So an omission means failing to act, right? Now, normally, criminal law punishes actions such as assault, theft, homicide, fraud. But Beardsley asks, can someone be criminally punished for doing nothing? So the facts of this case are controversial even today. So Mr. Beardsley was spending time with a woman named Blanche Burns while his wife was away. Burns was not Beardsley's wife. She was essentially his mistress. And during their time together, Burns consumed morphine and became unconscious. It's debated whether or not she was trying to kill herself or overdose with the morphine, but the point is, she became unconscious, and instead of seeking help, Beardsley and another individual moved her to a location and attempted to conceal the situation. Beardsley moved Burns to the basement, hoping that she would recover, and that when she awoke, he would be able to move her from the house. However, Burns ended up dying, and the government attempted to charge Beardsley with manslaughter for failing to obtain medical assistance for Burns' health. The central legal issue was, did Beardsley have legal duty to help Burns? Notice the wording carefully. Not did he behave morally, not was his behavior selfish, not should he have helped. The legal question was specifically, did the law impose a duty on Beardsley for him to act? The court ultimately said no. The court held that Beardsley did not have a legal duty to rescue Burns. Therefore, his failure to help her could not support criminal liability for manslaughter. Now, this outcome still shocks many students initially. A lot of people think that he should have clearly helped her, and morally, I would agree with this statement, many people do. But criminal law generally doesn't punish people for simply failing to rescue strangers. So clarifying the distinction between a moral duty versus a legal duty, and this is the core distinction of the entire lecture. A moral duty is what we believe people should do ethically, but a legal duty is what the law actually requires people to do. These are not the same thing. So the court essentially said, yeah, Beardsley might have failed morally, but moral failure alone does not automatically create criminal liability. So you may be asking, when does a legal duty exist? In criminal law, legal duties usually arise only in specific situations. For example, a parent to a child, a spouse to a spouse, caregiver to a dependent person, contractual obligations, or situations where someone created the danger themselves. These are called special relationships. And the court did not believe that Beardsley's relationship with Burns qualified as the kind of legally recognized special relationship that imposed a duty to rescue. So now we move on to omissions versus actions. American criminal law strongly prefers punishing harmful actions rather than failures to act. Why? Well, there are several different reasons here. First, it's easier to identify harmful actions than failures to help. Second, if the law broadly punished omissions, where would liability stop? Would everyone nearby be criminally responsible? Would failing to donate money become criminal? Would ignoring homeless individuals become illegal? The law generally avoids forcing citizens into broad affirmative duties towards strangers. So, public policy concerns, there are quite a few of them. Imagine creating a rule that says, everyone must rescue anyone in danger. So this sounds morally appealing at first, but the courts immediately encounter difficult questions with this. What if helping risks your own safety? What if multiple people are nearby? What if you freeze in a panic? What if you lack the training necessary to help someone? So the courts often worry that broad duty to rescue laws would become difficult to enforce fairly. And now this brings us to Good Samaritan laws. I don't know if you've ever seen an episode of Seinfeld. I'm probably dating myself a little bit with this, but point is, they were jailed for a Good Samaritan law of not helping somebody who was mugged on the streets. Point being, many states have Good Samaritan laws that encourage people to help others during emergencies. Importantly, these laws usually don't require rescue. Instead, they often protect rescuers from liability if they attempt to help in good faith. So, for example, if someone overdoses and another person calls 911, some states provide legal protections against certain drug possession charges. These laws try to encourage emergency assistance without broadly criminalizing non-intervention. Now, if we look at things like modern overdose situations, which is just an incredibly relevant issue today, let's just imagine that someone overdoses at a party. You have some questions that immediately arise. Does anyone present have a legal duty to help? What if people panic and leave? What if someone delays calling 911? Different states handle these situations differently. Some jurisdictions now impose limited duties in overdose context, especially when someone created or contributed to the danger. But generally speaking, Beardsley still reflects that traditional rule, that there is usually no broad legal duty to rescue strangers. So now let's cover social host liability. Social host liability is another important modern concept, and this refers to situations where an individual hosting gatherings may face liability for harms connected to alcohol or dangerous conduct. So for example, if someone knowingly serves alcohol to minors who later injure someone, legal liability may arise. Again, notice the pattern. Liability becomes more likely when a person's conduct contributes to creating the danger. And this is where we transition into Marsalis v. LaSalle. So I want to compare Beardsley to Marsalis v. LaSalle. This case is extremely important because it shows how a legal duty can arise once someone voluntarily undertakes responsibility. So moving into the facts of Marsalis v. LaSalle, Marsalis visited LaSalle's grocery store, where LaSalle owned a cat. LaSalle's pet cat attacked Mrs. Marsalis, and Mr. Marsalis had claimed that LaSalle promised to keep the cat locked up for 14 days to ensure that it didn't have rabies. But the cat escaped, which led to Mrs. Marsalis having to receive a course of rabies vaccinations, where she allegedly suffered adverse reactions to these vaccinations, and she was subsequently hospitalized. She then sued LaSalle. The court held that once the defendant voluntarily undertook responsibility for handling the situation, a duty arose to exercise reasonable care. Now, notice how this is critically different from Beardsley. In Beardsley, no legal duty existed initially. In Marsalis, a legal duty arose because the defendant voluntarily assumed responsibility of the cat. Now, when we compare these two cases, just notice the contrast right away. Beardsley, there was no recognized special relationship. There was no legal duty to rescue. Omission alone was insufficient. In Marsalis, defendants voluntarily acted. Responsibility was assumed by the defendant, and reasonable care became legally required as a result. And together, these cases teach us that legal duties are often narrow and situation-specific. So let's test these ideas. Scenario 1, you see a stranger collapse on the sidewalk and you continue walking. Is this immoral? Possibly. Illegal? Usually not. Scenario number 2, let's say you start CPR on someone, but you perform it recklessly after claiming medical expertise. Now, a legal liability may arise because you voluntarily assumed responsibility. Scenario 3, let's say your friend overdoses at your apartment and you hide them instead of calling for help. Well, now we begin moving much more closer towards modern criminal liability issues. So today's major lesson is simple but powerful. The law does not punish every immoral act. People v. Beardsley teaches us that moral responsibility alone does not automatically create criminal liability. Marsalis v. LaSalle teaches us that legal duties can arise when responsibility is voluntarily assumed. And together, these cases force us to confront one of the hardest questions in the law. What do we owe other people? And when should the government have the power to enforce those obligations?